I look at it like, this is your recipe. This is your, I want to bake a cake. How? Step 1, do this. Step 2, do this, right? So in Act 2, we're actually watching the character try to achieve the goal, successfully or unsuccessfully. So being able to see them actually take physical steps towards doing that thing is what we're watching. Now we're going to start putting in the complications, and I like to call it complications and not conflict, because people see conflict and they go, just add some negative something, right? But a complication is something that's very specific to stand in the way of the goal, right? So they're going to start coming in contact with things that are hindering them from getting what they need, things that are redirecting them, things that are causing them to hit rock bottom. And then you need a midpoint. And your midpoint sounds like what it is, right? It happens kind of in the middle of your story. It doesn't have to literally be on page 45 of the 90 pages, but it's gonna happen somewhere around there. And it basically means that something big enough happens to cause that redirection. Either I'm gonna hit rock bottom, or I have a false victory, or I receive some information that changes my goal. So I believe I gave this example, I've given this example before because it's the easiest one for me. If my goal was to find my kidnapped child, at the midpoint I find out that my kidnapped child has already been killed, right? That doesn't mean the story is over though, because we're only at the midpoint. That means my goal has to change. So now my goal is not to find my child. My goal is to find the killer, to get revenge, to get justice. And so for the rest of the screenplay, we're gonna watch the parent do that, right? Instead of looking after the child. So the goal changes. Something causes a redirection. And then some people look at the climax as what happens at the end of Act 2. Some people look at it as what happens at the beginning of Act 3. Either way, it's in the same place, in my opinion. So you're also gonna be getting your character up to the point where they actually are face to face with that goal or face to face with that antagonist, so they can win or lose. So those are the biggest beats. They need that trial and error time, or fun and games time, or steps to their recipe time. They need those complications that get in the way of that, so they can grow, so they can redirect. They need that big moment, whatever that midpoint is, that causes a new goal, makes them redirect, makes them hit rock bottom, so someone has to come in and re-motivate them. Right now your mentor character gets to come in and give a speech or whatever and get them going. If you're watching an episode of Grey's Anatomy, that's the moment where it's like, I found the new cure, right? At first we thought we'd never be able to do this surgery. Oh no, we didn't do well. I found this new thing. And now for the rest of the episode, they're gonna do the new thing until they win or lose, or save the patient or not save the patient. And then you'll go up to the climax, which is where they save the patient or not save the patient. So those are the beats that you're looking for in Act 2.
So if we used our Pam from the office, and so she's at home doing the Zoom, she's already now met this woman at a store who says, email me, I've got this really cool job if you want to make some extra money. And Pam is already doing the job by Act 2?
Maybe.
Okay.
It depends on what the goal of the episode is. So if we're looking at meeting this woman as the inciting incident, the problem can be deciding to call her or not. And if that's the goal, deciding to call her, then the journey is going to be the decision. Now she's going to have, I don't know what she's doing to figure out whether she should make this call or not, but that may mean that everything we're watching in her normal everyday is telling her, I need to change. I need a new thing that motivates the call, because it can be the end of the episode where she finally makes the call. Or it could be that I already know I'm going to call. I said I was going to call. So that means we're going to watch her call. We're going to watch her get set up with the new job. We're going to watch her do all of that in the second act, where she figures out what it is. And then again, seeing how that may cause friction with her current job. So really, again, it's always going to depend on what's the intended goal. Is the pilot, let's say this is the pilot, is the pilot about her choosing to go into this nefarious work? Or is the pilot about, I'm in it, what are the repercussions of it?
Okay, so something would have to happen. So let's say, and then the stuff that was happening for her to decide would happen in Act 1?
No, that's going to be Act 2.
Oh, Act 2.
And only because we're talking about television now. In television, if it's in television, we need that inciting incident by the end of Act 1. So now your Act 2 is going to be all the stuff that, yeah, I decided to take the job, I didn't decide to take the job, this is why, this is what's happening with my other job, and then in Act 3, you resolve. And depending upon what the goal was, if she's choosing to take the job, then in Act 3, we finally hear her say, I'm going to take the job. If it was, no, I've chosen this job, and the problem is trying to balance, then by the end of Act 3, we'll know what the rest of the season is going to look like, because we just saw how this balance works or doesn't work. Or maybe she didn't find out that it was nefarious until the climax of the episode. So in Act 3, she has to decide to continue, even though she knows that it's nefarious. So it can go a million ways. But basically, whatever that goal is that we get by the end of Act 1, when that inciting incident happens, she meets Pam at the end of Act 1. Pam says, call me. In Act 2, we're going to either see her call and then get onboarded, or decide to call, which means now we have to see what motivates that. Because if this is so far out of her life, she would never do something like this, then that means whatever's happening during this day in this episode is the stuff that's pushing her to finally make the call.
Okay, so maybe she gets a text in the middle of the night and it's urgent and they've got to fax something overseas, and hey, I'm really sorry to bother you, I knew you were sleeping, this needs to happen ASAP. And then maybe she sees the webcam light come on her work computer, and she realizes there's like some type of a snooping software, and it's recording her, and it knows that she took like a 10-minute walk around the block and she wasn't on the computer, and so she's now feeling trapped by this job, and she says, okay, I might email this interesting lady, and the interesting lady gets back to her at like midnight. Hey, here it is, and this is what you do, here's a link. And she goes, maybe she has a glass of wine, and she decides to apply for the job. And now she's giving reviews on lingerie. It's not horrible, it's like something where,
Yeah, because, you know, if we're saying that it's in the tone of The Office, and that means it's a half-hour single camera, so it's going to be, you know, kind of light, kind of funny. They have, you know, small things happening here and there that could be a little darker, right? But that means we're talking about 3-act structure, and we're talking about half hours, so you don't have a lot of time. So it can be something that simple, that, you know, I got back, I got this card, I might never do that. And now I'm sleeping and enjoying myself, and here come these people saying they need this fax, and this thing, and that thing, and I just want something new. All right, I'll make the call. Let's do something new.
Okay. And so, and then in Act 3, something entirely different is going to happen.
Possibly, depending upon what happened in your Act 2, since it's all cause and effect. But because we're talking about television, and because we're talking about the pilot, by the time we get to the end of Act 3, we need to understand what the series is about. So we need to know that she has decided to do this, and either we already know it's nefarious or we don't, so that's what we're going to find out in the series, or we realize it's getting in the way of her current job, and so we're going to watch her kind of balance it throughout. So we'll need that information. So sometimes in pilots, usually when it's kind of like a whodunit kind of thing, in a half-hour single camera comedy, they usually tie up things with a pretty decent bow at the end of the episode, right? But if we're talking about 1-hour dramas, if we're talking about a whodunit kind of limited series thing, and at the end of every episode, you're giving some new information. So yes, something new is going to happen, so that I'll come back to the next episode. And that new information might be, it wasn't who you thought it was, you know, or this is a new person doing something sneaky, or whatever it is, yeah.
What mistakes do writers make in Act 2 that end up ruining their screenplay?
Yeah, this is where you know they've done the structure. This is where you know they haven't figured out what their story was before they got to the page. Because this is where Uncle Such and Such shows up. This is where, this is the goal, this is the story, and the writer is doing this. Because they don't know what the goal of the story is, or they don't know how to get to Z from A. And you know, maybe it's because they're just a new writer, so they really just don't know how, or they don't understand structure, so they're doing all of these other things to get to Z, but none of those things connect. Going back to cause and effect, none of those things connect. So that happens quite often, and I think that's the biggest thing. Sometimes there is no midpoint And depending upon what kind of story it is, what the tone is, what the genre is, the midpoint doesn't have to be something huge, but it's bigger than your other trials and tribulations. So sometimes people are missing that thing that gets us over the hump. Because once we get into Act 2 and we get into those trials and tribulations, if it's take a step, fail, take a step, fail, take a step, fail, by the time they're doing that the fourth time, I'm no longer invested. You know what I mean? I need something that's going to change this thing to get us going in the story. So it goes back to, having that friend or cousin who's really great at telling stories, right? They know how to hook us in, make us think that this one thing is happening, and then take us to the next thing, right? So that midpoint kind of gets us over that hump of they've been trying and failing or trying and succeeding, and here's something that's going to change this whole thing for us, so that the pacing can kind of start to rev up and we can get to the climax. So a lot of times that's missing. Also, the climax is missing, but more so in television pilots that I read than in features. It seems like feature writers kind of understand a little bit more that there needs to be this high point. In TV, because people are thinking about the series, and if you're writing a pilot and you're creating a world and characters that people can be invested in, they sometimes forget about the structure of it and forget that, yeah, but we're still telling the story. So I mean, you gotta get up, right? And so a lot of times that's missing. And so if you're writing a half-hour single camera comedy, that means, or a dramedy, then you have 3 acts. So your climax is gonna happen at the end of Act 2 or at the top of Act 3, depending upon how you write it. If you're doing a 1-hour drama, and let's just stay in the 5-act place, because there's 4 acts that exist and 6 acts, whatever. Let's stay in the 5-act place, and it's gonna happen at the end of Act 4 or top of Act 5, depending upon how you write it. So a lot of the times in TV, there's just never makes it to a peak. It just kind of stays here the whole time. And no matter what stories you're telling, pilots, features, even if you're writing a spec and you're doing an episode of something, we're looking for stories to do this. We're on a roller coaster. So we don't want to spend our whole time like this. We don't want to spend our whole time like this. We don't want to spend the whole time like that. We have to have all of it happening. If not, it's not a fun ride and no one wants to get on.
And so Uncle Gus's method would be, he would just be telling too much sort of sidebar detail that we don't need, whereas the other person at the, let's say the family barbecue, they have like A, B, and C, a very clear point.
Very clear points,
okay.
Very clear path. And by the time Uncle, Gus is done, and you ask Uncle Gus, so what happened? He probably wouldn't even tell you the same story if you asked again, right? Because he's just talking about everything and doesn't know, his point, his end goal, right? Or he gets to the end goal, but we're all lost because none of the stuff between when he started and the end goal made any sense. Because they're not connected. Everything has to be connected, right? And the other cousin knows how to make A connect to B, connect to C, connect to D. Uncle Gus is saying A, G, E, M. It's like, wait, what happened to B and C and D? Like I'm missing something. And give me this other information. And he's cracking himself up and no one else is laughing because we missed the joke. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's that kind of stuff that starts happening.
Peter, when we first met you, I believe it was 2014 in the summertime. So it's almost been 4 years now, exactly. And we heard from you, and this interview's done incredibly well, as all of yours have. But this one, I'd love to play it for you if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay, great. I know this feels like a Senate hearing, but it's not. I
I didn't do anything criminal.
Good,
I remember that. I got my lawyer to do it.
Good. Okay, no, this is about, we'll keep it on screen right in here, and we have a great clip to play, so here we go. And
That I'm no good at. The reason that I'm a teacher and a consultant and a story doctor is that my big secret is I don't enjoy writing screenplays. I try for a while to do it, but it's not my thing. If poetry paid, I'd be in the church, because I love poetry. That's what I love to write. And I also like to write novels. But years ago, the reason I became what I am is, I failed to complete the screenplay, got huge interest in it, and I realized at the end of it, I don't like this form. It's just not for me. I love analyzing it. I love understanding how it works. I love helping other people do it. But I don't enjoy sitting down every day writing the screenplay form. It's not my thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, so that was 4 years ago, and what I found from an email from you is that you've actually completed a historical TV series?
Yeah, and I still hate writing.
Okay, so nothing's changed.
I'm always gonna hate it.
Okay.
I was just telling Susie yesterday, God, I hate this. But I'll tell you, yes, I've had some success, and what's great about that is that it's, here's the really great thing. Because when you're a teacher, you don't really know for sure. My stuff actually helps, it actually turns out to work. The stuff I've been teaching actually has helped me, which is a huge relief, because when you're a teacher, you're often up there and it's easy to pontificate and say, oh, do this, in this form, try this tool. But some of my tools were terrible, but a lot of them actually work. But I still hate writing. And that's always probably going to be the case. And I think maybe there are some writers who...
Thank you, Hannah, very much indeed. And I'm going to go completely off script to start with and say, as an Islington girl, how wonderful it is to be back in the Union Chapel. As many of you here as when I came to see Billy Bragg. You're very brave to come out on a rainy Monday night. We're very pleased that you haven't lost that, that you're coming to live events. We very much look forward to hearing from our speakers in just a moment and your participation. And of course, we'll start with a really small topic. No point in messing about it. We went for the big topic of intelligence squared tonight. And I thought it was an interesting moment to step back before the internal political party fighting and to invite two people with very wide-ranging views and very wide-ranging experience of the topic. But before they get their say, in a democratic manner, I think you should have your say first, or at least in your show of hands, a way of communicating with us. So we're going to ask first, who thinks capitalism, albeit with tweaks and reforms, is still the best economic system we've got? So if you think that, give us a wave. This is fabulously good. She's off. Gillian's just...
I think that's my job in this whole event.
Did you hand up just a minute? Can I have a look? Is everyone scientifically taking stock? I like the way that Gillian voted for herself there. It's a good moment. And who thinks we need a completely new economic system? Thank God, because otherwise it was the wrong booking. But that was clearly capitalism can be fixed in our audience now. But I would say from Intelligence Squared debates I've done a few recently, obviously less interesting in the sense of being online only, there was quite a lot of shifting around once the people had heard the speakers. So that is really where we're going to go next. I would perhaps give them this challenge from the Marxist literary critic Frederick Jameson, who once said, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." I wonder whether that is still the case. I'm going to turn first. I think Janice is going to lead us off tonight, if I read my annals true. Janice Varoufakis will be known to many of you from our screens and his fiery contributions to this debate. He was Greek finance minister from January to July 2015, a short period, but one in which he managed to be in the headlines in those days. He resigned, refusing to sign a loan agreement on the grounds it would worsen Greece's economic circumstances, which brought him into some conflict with Angela Merkel, just leaving the international stage as German Chancellor at the moment. Nowadays, he is chair of political economy at the University of Athens, as well as visiting professor of political economy at King's College London, a best-selling author of many books, including Another Now, Dispatches from an Alternative Present, clue there, I think, and a wonderful one, actually, which I remember talking to him about a few years ago, called Talking to My Daughter About the Economy, a Brief History of Capitalism. I once interviewed Janice and said, "You're a bit of a champagne socialist, aren't you?" He said, no, not really, but so I don't like champagne, but I like very good white wine. I hope that's still the case. Janice Varoufakis, the floor is yours. 5 minutes on can we fix capitalism?
Thank you, Anne. It is wonderful to be back, not only at the Union Chapel, but also with people in the same space. Okay, now the problem with these boys' games, Oxford Union debates, is that they force opponents to attack opponent. Either you're in favor of emotion or against emotion, which is fun, but not very helpful. So allow me to answer the question in my own way. I don't think it's an interesting question, whether we should fix capitalism. Because capitalism, and this is something that I have managed to convince myself of in the last year or so, and with the subject of my next book, I think that 2021 is a little bit like the 1790s, when Adam Smith was writing The Wealth of Nations. In the sense that the world was feudal, but there were small pockets of capitalism that were emerging, that Adam Smith managed to cobble onto. Glasgow University was happening just below him, in the Clyde Valley, he could see it. But it was tiny, it was a speck of capitalist dust in a desert of feudalism. Still, Adam Smith managed to see that what was growing under his window in the Clyde, in Manchester and elsewhere, was infecting feudalism, and feudalism was not going to be on the way out. Even when Marx was writing the Communist Manifesto, of whose the first 5-6 pages are a paean to capitalism, all about breaking down superstition and ushering in new technologies and so on. It was a kind of prequel to globalization, which was not actually taking place. He was ahead of his time. I think we are in a similar moment. I think that capitalism is on its way out, not because the left, our pathetic lot, have managed to overthrow. No, we have not done that. If anything, we have solidified capitalism. I'm talking about the left, through an orchestrated idiocy across many countries and continents. No, but capitalism is overthrowing itself, in the same way that feudalism overthrew itself. And here's some food for thought and for criticism by Julian. Look, before we can have any meaningful discussion about capitalism, we have to define our terms. What is capitalism? Capitalism has transformed itself so magnificently over the centuries. The capitalism of Adam Smith doesn't exist. It's not the baker, the brewer, the butcher. Since the Second Industrial Revolution, it was the Henry Fords, the Edisons, the large monopoly or oligopoly capital. Then we had big government with the New Deal and the Great Society. Then after that, we had financialized capitalism, rentier capitalism. It really has this capacity to transform itself. But throughout all these transformations, capitalism retained two main characteristics. First, the fuel that drives it is profit, profitability. Profit, which then gets reinvested, becomes new capital, and the thing goes on. The second characteristic of capitalism is markets. The creation of the labor market, following the enclosures, the eviction of the peasants from the lands created a mass of workers who then became the proletariat. The commodification of the land, every process, production process, extraction process, is happening through markets. So, profits and markets, central pillars of capitalism. Looking around, I already see it's at a very early stage. Wherever we look at, we see capitalist relations, there's no doubt about it. In the same way that wherever Adam Smith looked around the world, it was mostly feudal relations. But I think that I can already see the end of capitalism because, on the one hand, profits have ceased to be the fuel of the economic system we have. It is central bank money now. Without central bank money, the whole thing collapses. Even the sectors that big tech and so on, that are highly profitable, they are squeezing out all the other sectors, and participating in entering the markets and replacing them with platforms. Amazon, Facebook, and so on, they are not alternative markets. They are new technological fiefdoms. You enter Amazon, you exit the marketplace, you exit capitalism, you enter a realm where everything that is being bought and sold is controlled by one algorithm, one person, one owner. This is like a fiefdom, only it's a techno fiefdom. So for me, the question is not, can we fix capitalism? The question is it true, is my hunch right, that we are already moving into a post-capitalist system, which I call techno-feudalism, for want of a better term, and given that this techno-feudalism is highly at odds with liberalism, with Adam Smith, not just with socialists, how do we plan our collective strategy for not becoming techno-peasants within this global techno-feudalism?
You left us there hanging on a note where many of us have probably spent the day feeling like techno-peasants one way or the other as we struggled with the bits of technology which they told us long ago would make our lives easier and seem to take up about 3 hours of the day. So that's a really interesting challenge. And particularly we'll hang on to that final point. We're going to hear a bit of to and fro conversation between our panelists in just a moment, which I'll moderate. But we must hear from Gillian Tett for the other side of the coin on fixing capitalism. And no one better to discourse on that. Gillian is chairman of the US editorial board, US editor at large of the Financial Times. She has covered capitalism, I think. In how many countries would you say over your career, Gillian?
Quite a lot.
Quite a lot, she said, mystifyingly. But certainly not only American capitalism, but the UK, Asian, based in
like everyone dying.
So you have a truly global prism on this. She's also co-founder of the very successful Moral Money section of the Financial Times, which is dedicated to environmental, social and governance, i.e. ESG in the new lingo, news that investors and companies are increasingly embracing. Her new book is Anthrovision, How Anthropology Can Explain Business and Life, and she's a former academic anthropologist by background in her first degree. So a very broad view of capitalism, Gillian, what it means, how it works, and I'm suspecting how you think it might be fixed.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Anne. It is great to be here tonight. I feel at a disadvantage with Janice as my adversary because not only have I ever tried to run an economy, but sitting here in Islington, he is on his home turf, home pitch, and I'm not. But I'm going to try and defend capitalism, but not the current form of capitalism. Because I'm trained as an anthropologist, and one of the things anthropologists spend a lot of time doing is look at the gap between what people say they do and what they actually do.
Oh, what?
Between the rituals
People
and symbols they
do
inspire
say
to
something and
the
do
actual
something else?
reality.
What?
And the core of my argument is that the capitalist flag, the flag of Adam Smith that Jan has talked about, has been waved around a lot in recent years by politicians, by business leaders, by financiers, yes, by financial journalists. But what we have today is not what Adam Smith sketched out. To understand that, you have to go back and realise that there are 2 books of Adam Smith, and only one has been focused on in recent years. The Wealth of Nations lays out a theory about why competition is good. I happen to believe, to channel, I hate to say it, Boris Johnson, by quoting Winston Churchill, that actually competition and profit is the worst way to organise an economy, except for all the others that have been tried. I say that having lived in the former Soviet Union, where I did my research, and seen other visions playing out. But when Adam Smith laid out his vision of capitalism, his vision of market forces, he didn't use the word capitalism, his vision of markets, he had 2 books. The Wealth of Nations, about competition and trade, and The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is one of the inspirations for the Moral Money column, which I co-founded at the Financial Times. And that vision essentially argued that there were 4 components you needed to make markets effective. You needed to have free access to markets. People had to be able to take part in them. You need to have free access to prices. People needed to know what the prices were in a transparent way. You needed to have an illusion of ownership between the people who managed ventures and actually owned them, which in Adam Smith's day were mostly family-owned firms, so it wasn't a problem. And you needed to have a shared moral, ethical, and legal base, which basically provided a foundation for people to have shared values and shared trust. Remember, the roots of the word credit come from the Latin to trust, and without that, it's very hard to have a market. Now, if you dial back and think about what was happening 2 decades ago on Wall Street,
there's no trust.
you can see that all 4 of those components were missing. People did not have equal access to the markets because guess what? It was powerful cartels on Wall Street and the City of London who were running the show. They didn't have access to prices because yes, you can get access to stock market prices, but there's many other prices in finance that are not visible to the wider public. There wasn't effective illusion of ownership and management because guess what? The people who were supposedly owning companies, which is all of us for our pension funds, tended to outsource that to asset managers who were largely asleep at the wheel and didn't understand what was happening inside companies. And there hasn't been a shared moral framework, or even one would argue a legal and ethical framework, essentially putting what's been happening in business and finance into the wider social context. Anthropologists are obsessed with context, obsessed with a sense of consequence of what business and finance does. I would argue that many of those shortcomings are found in other areas of modern capitalism, such as the tech sector, which Janice just spoke about. I'd actually agree with you that there is a fundamental problem of monopoly power, of a lack of transparency, of a lack of access inside the tech sector as well. And so I would agree with you that capitalism actually isn't particularly effective there at the moment because we don't actually have that at the moment. We have a gap between rhetoric and reality. And yet, I personally still think that vision of raising profits to be reinvested back in growth, that idea that actually innovation occurs when you have some friction, when you have a sense of personal responsibility, that is still to be using, to be driving and coming forward. So, for those reasons, I remain a fan of Adam Smith when we look at both books. And I think these are the 2 last ideas, which is
Falling asleep at the wheel.
how it's like to
I make you think it was real.
As an anthropologist again, I'm fascinated by words and language.
Come on, wake me
I
up.
don't know how you can know
Why would I?
where the word company comes from originally.
Yeah,
Which I
I wonder why.
The original comes from Latin, from old meaning with bread.
Maybe because you took out all that psychological abuse.
And then the business bread.
But I'm tense that I don't know what to do with your lies and bullshit. Why would you be my Firefly? You're burning me from the inside.
Basically never-ending loops of money going round and round, like sugar in a candy floss maker, building a bigger and bigger pot of speculation, except convenient. But originally, finance was about paying off the other and finishing the actual tangible commercial transaction. It was a means to an end, not an end in itself. So, to go back to Adam Smith and put those 2 bits together, the vision of capitalism that I uphold is one where companies are recognized to be about human groups of people, competing together, building things together, and money is a means
You don't want to wake up.
of fuel.
It's not my job. I've already tried and you don't want to wake
That
up.
is a vision.
Fucking stay asleep in your fucking narcissistic dream.
And I say last of all, Janice and I both got the dark blue shirt memo, so we end up agreeing more than disagreeing, sadly.
Pretend us. Yeah. This song is too real.
Question both of you. And it's just trying to put together a list in my head, and it's a pretty obvious one, but it goes something like this: Karl Marx,
Well, we work yourself up, you can't. I'm not strong enough to pop your delusion because you want to keep it alive, asshole.
Jeremy Corbyn.
That's the fucking problem.
Sort of in illustrious company. You see the line of
Why
argument
do
is
everyone have to do everything for you, assholes?
of capitalism.
Fucking do something beside manipulating
And yet,
people.
we all are having a discussion about whether we
It's
should
your
do
job
this
to
or
understand
not.
shit.
The list
You have nothing else to do than listen, and you can't even do that. And you're like, I'm such a good listener.
Quite right.
Bitch.
Every
When you're a
socialist,
good listener, when someone is giving you a tiny, not argument, but a tiny
eventually does the
compliment, you make it like you believe you're like speaking French when you say croissant. Ben oui, c'est mon grand.
2008, so eventually
Stop the
all
delusion.
our predictions come true. It doesn't mean we were right analytically about it.
Never
Look,
gonna happen. Keep bullying and manipulating
Why
people
not
and believe you're a fucking good person.
this time,
You fucking assholes.
to quote famous economists,
Kill them with love. For your own good, I'm
First-
concerned.
I'll
No, you're
repeat
just
some
trying
things you said, but in a different manner.
Have
hopefully.
position of control as usual.
Take what happened in the summer
You
of
can't
2020.
Manage your own life, so you have to manipulate someone else's.
When you had the
Fucking
announcement
twats. Fucking wasps.
that your GDP fell by more than 20%
And I wanted you to
for
follow
the first
me,
time in the history of
to
British
come with me. What a freaking mistake.
August 2020. The market expectations were for a fall of about 12%.
Delusion.
It was much, much more than that. And yet 16 minutes later, the London Stock Exchange went up. That has never happened before in the history of capitalism. Why did it happen? For a very logical reason. Because market players thought, oh my God, 20 plus, then immediately, nanoseconds later, they thought, okay, if we're panicking, the Bank of England are panicking. So they're going to print loads of money. And they will pump it in our direction, okay, to refloat the disaster. So let's keep buying. Okay, now, this is simply a little tale that I tell, to capture the manner in which financial markets have completely decoupled from really existing capitalism. And if you think about it, in 2008 we had a 1929, our generation of 1929. The difference with 1929 was that unlike the Hoover administration in the United States in 29 that let the banks fall, the G7, G20, April 2009, Gordon Brown, London, they decided to refloat them. So they went into a spasm of printing mountain ranges of money to refloat the financial markets, which they did very successfully. Proof that if they want to do something, they do. They do it, right? But ever since they did that, and they did it in a staggered way, the European Central Bank really began doing it in 2012 and then went all out in 2015 with Mario Draghi, 1st of March. But the way I see it now, capitalism is completely hooked on the central bank money. And therefore, why is Jeff Bezos $50 billion richer than he was at the beginning of the pandemic? It's not the profits of Amazon, of his businesses. It is the increase in the share. Because what happens is, QE means that the central bank prints money, they give it, they effectively given a larger overdraft to the Barclays banks, Deutsche banks of the world. They look at you people, they say, I'm not going to lend them because they're hopeless. So they pick up the phone, they call Volkswagen, Siemens, Alstom, Google, Apple, and say, do you want a few billion? Those people don't need money because they're already established. It's simple because corporations should be borrowing, not not saving, but they take the money because it's free. And they take it and they go to the stock exchange and they buy back their own shares. Okay, so now you have a bifurcation of capitalism. You have the companies that maintain profitability because it's not monopoly that they have. For me, Amazon, General Motors had a monopoly or an oligopoly. Amazon is different. It's a platform. It means that you exit capitalism, you exit the market, and you go into a place where everything that's sold or bought are controlled by one company or another. That's very different.
Because there's quite a lot in there, and that Julian come
Okay,
back. But
just
on that QE, quite amusing money sloshing
sure.
in airports.
Just one final phrase.
Then I can throw it over to you.
Yeah, one final phrase. So, if what I'm saying holds water, then Adam Smith is simply not relevant. He's as relevant as Karl Marx was in the Soviet Union when you were there. In other words, not at all.
So you're saying Adam Smith's not relevant because the financial markets today don't tie into the real economy, and because essentially you have platform monopolies on technology.
Yes, and even the companies that are not platform companies, through private equity takeovers, they're being taken over, loaded with debt, which is financialized. Those companies are then split up, asset stripped. So you have the squeezing of the capitalist sector, of what Adam Smith would consider to be the capitalist sector. The squeezing of it completely until all you have is central banks on the one hand, financial markets, and the platforms.
So let me turn around and say it like this. Would you believe that competition is a good thing in an economy?
Absolutely. I wrote a book about
Okay, let me ask 4 questions. Do you believe that prices are useful?
No.
Yes.
For the one
Okay.
making money because
Do
they
you
have
believe
money,
that
yes.
profits
Not
are
for
a good
us,
thing
the
as an
people.
incentive, and that you should reinvest profit back into ventures?
No. But I do believe
Okay,
that.
we have
No,
all-
hang on. Jimmy, wait. Because when you read this, you'll see. There's a chapter in there called Markets Without Capitalism. Right? So in it, I try to answer your question by, in this book, I try to create a blueprint of how we would have done things differently.
This is the book.
So in my utopia, in this utopia, in the other now that I call it, markets are essential because Iris, the anthropologist, modeled after you, as you know, she says that at some point that the only thing that stops authoritarianism and a Soviet kind of gulag from descending upon us is markets and competition and freedom of enterprise. But the problem is that the moment you have share markets that are being effectively turbocharged through central bank money, and you have the financialization that you experience and you explain very nicely in the book, then the competition dies.
So your basic argument is with equity markets and the current form of equity markets and stock holding companies, if I understand it rightly. I mean, let me say this. If you believe that competition is valuable, if you believe that prices matter, if you believe in a diversification of different roles and specialist functions, and that's good.
I believe in all that.
Okay, well that doesn't make you sound very socialist, with all due respect.
Well, that is not true. Do you remember Oscar Lange?
Sorry?
Oscar Lange.
Right?
Do you remember Oscar Lange?
Yeah.
You may need to remind us.
1920s. One of Friedrich von Hayek's great adversaries. The other was John Maynard Keynes. Oscar Lange was a socialist, communist actually, who believed in not a central. He was completely against the idea of Gostman or a central plan, but he was in favor of what effectively I tried to map out in this book. A market where, let me give you an example, right? Imagine a world where you join a corporation and you get one share. In the same way that you enroll in university, you get a library card. And that library card, that one share, gives you one vote, it allows you to do stuff, borrow books, participate in decision making and so on. And then when you leave, you take your capital out and you have to hand over your library card, your one share. Now, just for a moment, go along with this. Imagine you have a market where you have competition between companies that are owned by those who happen to work in them. And you have, you ask whether I believe in profits. No, I don't, because if you have that system, you have net revenues. Because there is no distinction between profits and wages. Everybody profit shares.
I'm only going to chip in and ask, you did say you believed in competition,
Absolutely.
diversity, so I wanted to know what you're going to do with your profits. Do you like that? Then you said that's not socialist, and you said, well, actually it is. But then I got a bit confused. Sorry, this is a bit...
What,
it's an alternative real
define your
economics,
confusion, so
of course, but what would you do with the profits?
Or you invest them, or you divide them. So let me give you an example, and this is a really existing example. I won't mention the company, but I've worked for that company back in 2011, 2012. It's in Washington State, United States. So imagine...
Look it up.
Look it up. Imagine a company where the revenue, total revenue, is divided into 4 parts. One part is from fixed costs, rents, servers and stuff. The second part is R&D. The third part is the basic income of everybody working from the janitor all the way to the arch designer. And the fourth part is bonuses. And imagine that the R&D segment is decided as a result of a vote where the member employees vote between different business plans that are presented once a year, once every 2 years. The basic pay the same, and the bonuses are decided on the basis of the Eurovision Song Contest scoring system, where every employee gets 100 points, but you can only distribute them, award them to other people depending on your understanding, your appreciation of their estimation.
So the problem is with your...
That sounds actually quite good,
So-
except Britain would always lose.
So, this is a different corporate structure, right? The company wants to maximize its revenues. There is competition, but there's no capitalism.
It doesn't
And
sound
there's no
so
distinction
fun.
between wages and profits.
Okay, the idea that workers get skin in the game, yes, absolutely. The idea they have some checks and balances and some involvement, absolutely. The idea you're going to organise 500 people into a committee to take strategic business decisions and take votes. Have you ever tried organising 10 people into taking swift decisions?
Well, I'm Greek, so I can't organize myself. I have 5 opinions.
Therein lies my point.
5
Because
opinions.
I think you have a slightly higher vision of what humans will do to left their own devices.
No, but it doesn't have to be a committee. It doesn't have to be a committee. Firstly, look, in the
Well,
company...
in practical terms,
in the company I work...
can you name one cooperative that has actually swelled in size and become a really effective operation?
Okay, let me tell you that the company I'm referring to had 350 employees and $1.2 billion of revenue a year. And it worked really very well with completely flat management.
So why aren't there more companies copying that?
Because they're being gobbled up. This is why. Because, think of the Trustee Savings Bank. Remember what happened to it? It was gobbled up. So the idea of cooperatives that work is well established from the 19th century in this country. There are cooperative banks, cooperative supermarkets and so on that work magnificently, but in an environment, in an economic environment, where the large fish eats the smaller fish, especially the smaller energetic fish. It's happening in Silicon Valley all the time.
But the issue is
Google and so on, they're destroying competition by buying them up. So that company in particular, right? No idea. I mean, I'm sure you do. The extent to which there were all these attempts by big money to buy it out, and it will go.
But that's a separate issue. That's a separate issue because you're basically arguing two things. On the one hand, you have the question of what's the best way to organise a bunch of people who want to be in business and get money to fund that. Should they sit around as a happy cooperative and sing Kumbaya?
It doesn't have to be happy. It's not going to be happy. You know that.
Unhappy cooperative.
Blow.
But that's one question, i.e., how do they get money to finance what they're doing? And the second question then is there a regulatory structure to create a level playing field that stops the winners from essentially taking all and buying up the other. So two separate questions.
This is great.
And I would agree on the second point that absolutely we need better umpires to create regulatory structures that stop winners taking all and doing unfair competition. Comes back to my points that Alice said. On the question of how to organise companies, yes, cooperatives can sometimes work. Yes, I happen to think that with digital technology, probably it's getting easier to organise that than before. And digital transparency is changing things radically, and I think in many ways may be the saviour of capitalism. And I can talk about that if you want. However, I happen to think that in most cases, the ability to raise outside money from people who have a stake in a company, which is called an equity market, is a pretty efficient way of doing it, unless, and I would agree with you, unless you have central banks printing oodles of cash, which essentially is distorting prices right now. I don't like what the central banks have done in recent years.
Yeah, but you know what, Gillian? It can't be otherwise. We are in this situation where now the central banks stop printing money. The whole thing collapses.
So you're saying you don't like capitalism 2021 version, but there could
what
be
I'm
other
saying is
sorts you do.
that you're being completely utopic in your...
I'm being utopic.
Absolutely.
You're being utopic.
Well, let's be utopic in a realistic
you're
way,
being
shall we?
And
No, but
I'm
I
wondering
think-
why it wasn't utopic.
I think the idea, for instance, the idea that
I
we
think
have...
utopic sounds much trendier than utopia.
Sounds like a nasty
I think that my utopia is more realistic than yours. The idea of going back to a capitalism that works is absolutely impossible now. And you mentioned, you talked about the importance of having umpires, of having proper regulation. It's impossible. They will always be
She's
stressed
and
now,
triggered.
under this what I call techno-freedom, is always going to be so gigantic that there is no government on this planet, however well-meaning its functionaries, that can do it. This is why I'm saying that if you really want competition and freedom and liberalism to be given a chance, we need to move away from share markets. We need to go to a system where you ask the question, where does the capital come in from? From savings. We need to do that which Adam Smith recognized, because Adam Smith was exactly on my side here. He was totally against public limited companies, because he understood that the moment you have liquid ownership, you have ownership split up in tiny little pieces that can be traded anonymously in the stock exchange, suddenly his prerequisites for a well-functioning competitive market are gone.
So why not just have pension funds, automatic enrollment, to have people owning asset, mutual funds and things like that, providing some of the fuel for investing in companies, and then combine that with radical digital transparency so that people can actually track what companies are doing and actually express an idea, a vote if they want to.
Because the pension funds are taken over. The pension funds will always be taken over by those who happen to have a great percentage of ownership than others. They will all, look at the three big State Street, Vanguard, and so on. They control 90% of the New York Stock Exchange. So who controls them?
So why not work on reforming the pension funds and getting better financial oversight and regulation, and working with a system that appears to actually in many ways spark innovation and growth? It can be done better, but why not work with that rather than aspire for something which has never actually materialized anywhere in the world on any scale effectively?
But Julian, capitalism never materialized anywhere in the world until it did.
Save it for the Q&A. We're going to be first. It's always good to know there's someone in the audience.
And in any case, I'm arguing that capitalism is already evolving out of itself.
I want to move us on because I think we danger perhaps on the markets and models. And a bit of a squeeze on Gillian on one point that I've heard, and this is the problem with big tech monopolies and what that means. I mean, just to remind ourselves the unprecedented levels of growth and consolidation.
So what are you going to do about it?
About
Facebook?
Yeah.
Because what I'm saying is, corporate law which says one employee, one share, that kills off the power of Facebook. What is your proposal?
Okay, say that.
Will you break up
even
Facebook?
more awkward. Right. Gosh, it's throwing out. It's throwing you up really beautifully. Just in your way. What I was thinking about. about what you said about the regulator, which is an interesting thought. But there's an example. Well, how many people in America and elsewhere run around in circles saying we need better regulation of the tech companies? Mark Zuckerberg doesn't give up. Anyway, it just doesn't happen. And to this point, I think Janice is right to be pushing on this.
Yeah, sure.
It would appear to be an area which is immune to the sort of reformist regulatory.
Okay, let me give my answer to Facebook, what I do about Facebook. It's different from what you expect. There's one thing that Adam Smith got totally wrong, in fact several things, but here's the most important thing for today. He thought that barter was an old-fashioned, prehistoric practice that really just involved cavemen sitting around in caves swapping piles of berries for meat. And he presumed that barter would essentially die out once you invented money and credit. He was 100% wrong. Economists automatically assume that barter is old-fashioned and doesn't matter. Anthropologists, and I don't know if there are any anthropologists here tonight,
This is your moment.
Anthropologists know that barter is actually something which has often been around in many communities at the same time as money and credit. Anyone who's read David Graeber's wonderful book, Debt the First 5,000 Years, will know this. But
Also,
also,
going to help us with the tech.
I'm going to tell you, barter is alive and well today, big time, because Silicon Valley actually runs off barter. The wholesale swap of data for services. That is a bedrock of much of the tech sector today. It does not involve money, and we have no way of talking about it day to day except to say that it's free. And we tend to only focus on one aspect of this, which is how tech companies take our data. We don't look at the services. The reason I say this is important because actually we're missing a lot of things that are happening in the economy today, and also in terms of corporate valuations. We're also missing something that I would bet, if I was to go to all of you in the room today and say, would you like to pay for your services that you get from Google, Facebook, your email?
Of course not.
Use money
Well, we
to buy
do.
all that, and in exchange, they can't take your data or they'll pay you for it. You might say, well, yes, for privacy reasons, but I guess that many of you would actually say, you know what,
No.
I don't want the hassle of having to use money to pay for it. I
Well,
like
like
free
you do pay
services.
to Google when you have
So
like
the
a
reason I mention all this is really
professional
important.
account anyway. So
If you want to reform tech today and create a more ethical tech system, you don't necessarily need to abolish barter. You need to change the terms of trade of barter. And that means essentially giving consumers more power in that barter trade, which involves one, more transparency about how data is being used, more transparency about what the companies are doing inside the company with your data, and most crucially, and this comes back to the power of market forces, data portability. If we had the ability to pull our data out of any tech company and go somewhere else, we'd actually have the beginnings of a proper market for our service, for us as customers.
but people don't want to do that, and they probably want to use many services with different data. That's the duplicity of identity that we're seeing because of thanks to trolls and all that. And it's kind of fair enough. You want to have your family identity on Google and Facebook, and then your professional identity at work. You don't transfer your data. You transfer your data, but you don't show off all your data, whether like personal data when you're with your family, your kids, your mom, your kid, or your colleague. So having that duplicity is exactly the personal mask that we wear daily, whether it's your core identity or what you show to your partner, or to your friends. That's all really different, and that's where usually abuse happen and stuff like that, because you show something to someone that is not the same something as you show someone else. So portability of data is not going to change anything.
Let me start with a no.
Okay, I take that as a B+.
Well, that's what you get with when you have an economist on the one hand, on the other hand. Remember what Truman said? I want a one-handed economist. I'm convinced that we need to change property rights over data, over personal data. So here we are, and actually in my utopic have it now, you'll find that there is a system called...
Okay, and if you haven't seen it, I'm going to show that I like the
don't
other
worry, don't worry. Just, there is
She's
I
too
just have
aggressive.
various systems. One is how banking will work in my socialist market system.
She
and
takes
also
the
how data should
she
work in the system where
she's supposed to defend a point, but she takes it personally.
we label
You're not
the
attacked
benefit of
personally, so you should not take it
tiny
personally.
micropayments that are automatically made by people so that they can also own their own data. So we're on the same page on this. But what you're suggesting is
But
not,
then
is
is
not doing anything about the power of Facebook.
when you have an
Anything about
argument,
the
a
power of
debate
housing,
like
because
that.
let's face it, the reason why people are on Facebook is because everybody else is on Facebook. So it's
Do you
sorry,
actually agree with the idea, or is it the
by changing
charismatic, influential
Yes, you
power
have
of
teenagers on Facebook.
the other
You have kids.
person that you
Teenagers
actually
with dead on Facebook.
fall for?
Fashions change.
Because some
Prices
people
fall.
have shitty arguments, but
whatever.
they sell
I
it
mean,
very
people are
well.
on TikTok. They will be on TikTok because the people they follow are on TikTok. So these are the network economies, which I understand very well. And when it comes to Amazon, there is this technological structure that supports
The human factor is so important in all those
non-market and based on power. And there's
contexts.
nothing you can do about that if you stick
It
to
depends
the
how
idea of liquid
well
property
the
that's
person
owned
is able
and
to
traded in
manipulate your
shares.
perception of the situation and your understanding of the situation.
To come back to this, so we just need to sort of move through a couple more cycles of themes, perhaps before we get to questions. It would be
Makes a
very
huge
remiss on the road to
difference.
COP26 not to talk about
Some people are trained to be liars. Lawyer.
planet Earth, and whether you think, Julian, that green growth is possible. I mean, you're a big, if you can be a big cheese, can you be a big cheese in ESG, a big environmentally friendly produced cheese in this area, suggests that you do believe in green growth. There are many reasons, are there not? If you look around the planet today and man-made global warming to say that capitalism has played a very negative role in that, and to be rather sceptical.
Yep, I'll come back to the fourth part of the Alan Smith framework I laid out about the need to have a shared ethical, moral, legal vision, and above all else, a theme that I go on about in my book, which is the need to move from tunnel vision to lateral vision. Most of the tools that we developed in the late 20th century to make sense of the world, like economic models, apologies Janice, because I know you're an economist, but these lovely economic models, these lovely corporate balance sheets, these lovely big data sets, are all very bounded and marked by tunnel vision.
You don't need to apologize.
She uses exactly. She has a lot of fallacies, you know.
They basically treat everything that isn't inside the economic model or the balance sheet as an externality or a footprint, something outside that model.
What has changed in there?
What I would
Because
argue is that one of the things that went
a
very
lot of
wrong
things are not the way they should be.
And the economic models was treating the environment as an externality. They ignored who was going to pay for the damage that was created or the cost of the natural resources they were
That's
using.
quite a big flaw in the capitalist argument, then.
Well, if you can actually start measuring that and putting that into your models, you start to get a very different vision of how companies are valued, how they're looking at the world. There are ways of doing that and people developing that. Impact-weighted accounting.
Impact-weighted accounting.
ESG
How many
accounting
of you going to throw Janice? Impact-weighted accounting.
Well, for that you need the regulation
The
that you are never going
fallacies.
to be able to have as long as power is so heavily concentrated. Look, let me give you an example, because at least we didn't manage to meet Anne this summer because half of Greece...
Because you just turned me down.
No, because half of Greece burned down and I was going for it. By the way,
That exactly is what happened, actually, in fairness, just to not be...
And you missed an important part of my CV these days. I lead a political party in Greece. You presented me as if I'm an author and professor.
I did.
That's a previous life.
So he actually has power.
You're registered
No
voters.
power.
And
I have the power to speak.
You aspire to have power.
Yeah, but the reason why I mentioned the fires is because, speaking of green growth, okay, I also believe that in green growth, but I also believe in green degrowth. There are things that need to grow and things that need to degrow. Like we need less cement, less CO2, less of all the toxic derivatives, the toxic fumes, right? We need fewer of those, fewer cars, whether they're electric or not, more public transport. But going back to the forest fires in Greece this summer, this is a failed state, right? But nevertheless, when it comes to profit making, it's very fast. So, the day after, we were devastated and the flames died down. Large corporations came and took over the attempt to prevent those forests from becoming mud baths with the first rains. So you think, oh, that's a good thing to help shore up the soil and all that. First thing they did was to offer contracts to the local population that effectively signed all their rights away for 20 years a day. Forget it, that's you could expect. But the second thing they did was they're trying to win new contracts for replanting the forests using genetically modified trees that will grow very quickly, and they will give them the opportunity to, in the context of the green transition, harvest biomass for the purposes of green energy. If we allow them to do this, you're going to have, under the cover of green growth, you're going to have the devastation of the flora and the fauna of the land, and the conversion of these areas in Evia and so on into fiefdoms of Monsanto Bayer, who will have genetically poisoned the land while making it very green. Now, is this the green growth that we want? This is the green growth that this market-based system, not because it's a market, but because Monsanto is not a market.
Okay,
They are a toxic monolith.
Let me come back to this point again. As I said, you are on your home pitch. There are numerous examples of greenwashing. There's numerous examples of companies and finances using the green label to do all kinds of egregious things. That I would completely agree with. However, one of the other reasons I believe in competition is that I believe in checks and balances. And I don't think we can sit there and trust government alone to turn us green. Back in the 1970s, when Milton Friedman developed his vision of shareholder capitalism, which I do not agree with, there were two things that were very different. One, back then, people thought that they could outsource the really difficult decisions in life, the social stuff, to governments, and companies just worried about their balance sheets. And secondly, you did not have radical transparency, and most people did not know what was actually happening inside companies. Today, we have a world where no one actually trusts the government to get stuff done, and we have a world where all of you have cell phones with extraordinary levels of access to information if you choose, and many aspects of corporate life are subject to radical transparency. The reason
Okay.
Hi there, Peterson. I've been wanting to ask you this for a while now since I started watching your lectures. After I started reading Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, I came upon a paragraph in his chapter on scholars that really bothered me. It actually bothers me to this day. He talked about this kind of person that they were just a mirror. Like they stretched, he said, every part of their skin basically to allow every new piece of information that they took on, and then all they ever were was just an instrument. They were just a mirror reflecting what they had learned, never actually having generated anything on their own. And it's bothered me because I feel like in a way it's sort of like it's impacted my identity a lot, because I don't know, how are you supposed to create something, you know?
Okay, well that's a really good question. I mean, Nietzsche is often classed with the existentialists, and So one of the tenets of existentialism, there's two real tenets of existentialism. There's more, but obviously we're oversimplifying that. One is that life is a problem. It isn't because there's something wrong with you. It's that life is a problem. And so that's often contrasted with the Freudian view, which is that if you have a problem, it's because something went wrong during your development. The existentialist said, no, it's like life is a problem, make no mistake about it. And that the purpose of scholarship is in some sense to solve that problem. And so for Nietzsche, like he said, all truths are bloody truths. And what he meant by that was that if an idea didn't incarnate itself in you and transform your perceptions and your actions, then you were merely possessed by the idea. You were merely a spokesperson for the idea. Or you could say that the idea possessed you. You're a puppet for the idea. It's not you. It's the idea is in you and it has you. You haven't taken the idea and incorporated it with you and made it part of your life. And so there's a romanticism that's associated with that, right? That's the passionate scholar, the person for whom ideas are not merely, what would you call abstracted representations that can be tossed about as if they're commodities. They're more like personalities. That might be another way of thinking about it. And so if those ideas are compelling, then you don't, like one thing I learned a long time ago, and I think this is probably relevant. I know when I was a kid, I liked to argue, and I liked to win arguments or lose them, although I like to do a lot better. But I didn't really mind so much what the content of the argument was. You know, I could engage in it like a sparring match, and it was in some sense to establish dominance, right? To establish intellectual dominance. I quit doing that when I was in my mid-20s because I thought that was too shallow an approach to the ideas. They're not commodities of that sort. They have tendrils that reach down into the living. That's the right way to think about it. And so Nietzsche's criticism of scholars, and he did this a lot, was that they were bloodless. You know, they were full of performative contradictions. That's another way of thinking about it. They'd say one thing and do another because their intellect was completely dissociated from their actions. And he thought that was a very bad idea. And I think that that's a good criticism. I think it is a bad idea. I also think it makes for an extraordinarily boring lecturer. You know, because you can tell if you're listening to someone whether the ideas that you're hearing are merely being passed through the person as if they're being memorized, say, or whether they're part of the dynamic core of the person. And if they're part of the dynamic core of the person, then they're almost always engaged.
They don't understand
and so
what they're saying. They just repeat what someone told them a few years before. And back in the days, they were denying it and they were like, no, you're wrong. And now they're actually just repeating the same shit because they realized that the person back in the days was right. And now they're taking that argument as their own, but they don't understand the logic under it because they have no logic. They have just delusions.
Into their own being. They haven't. It's like an incarnation in a sense. They haven't incarnated the ideas in embodied form. And so they're incomplete. You know, Nietzsche also in Thus Spake Zarathustra, when Zarathustra comes down the mountain, he sees a bunch of people gathered around.
And he's like, fuck that, I'm going back to the mountains because those people are crazy.
And when Zarathustra goes and looks at the person, all he sees is a little tiny midget with a gigantic ear. And so he's a hyper specialist, right? And so he has a pretty impressive ear, but he's only this big. And that was Nietzsche's imagistic commentary on the danger of hyperspecialization, and also on the danger of adulation for hyperspecialization. And because he thought about it as a kind of deformity. Now, Nietzsche was a pretty harsh guy, but he did address the issue of the relationship between intellectual knowledge and action. Because for Nietzsche, those things are not to be separated in some sense. So, yeah, so maybe, I don't know why, maybe it bothered you. Like, it's hard to say why it bothered you. It might have bothered you because it sort of undermines the idea of scholar. But the other possibility, and this isn't an accusation because obviously I don't know anything about you, but it might also be that it struck a chord, you know, and that maybe you were doubtful or questioning how tightly associated your intellectual endeavor was with your actual character and your practice. So that's another possibility. I mean, that's a really good thing to think about because generally speaking, that integration is very much lacking. People are a lot smarter and fluid with their ideas than they are ethical and consistent and characterized by integrity.
This is Dr. Jordan Peterson. He has quite the reputation. And once again, I have a lot of points. So, like Tony, means that he's qualified. So he has, like Tony, actually I believe Tony, you two were schoolmates in McGill. So they both have their PhD in clinical psychology in McGill. He's a professor at U of T since 1998. He was also a Harvard professor from 1993 to 1998. He's a practicing psychologist seeing clients on a regular basis, and he's wrote a seminal book entitled Meaning, The Architecture of Belief. And he's actually currently working on a revision of these ideas and to update them. He's a regular appearance on TVO, especially Stephen Pakin's The Agenda. He's a charismatic and inspirational speaker, receiving a number of teaching awards. And his research focuses mainly on the psychology of self-deception, religion, mythology, and narrative, and the sources of social and
Self-deception, bitch.
He talks for himself. He's well renowned.
Well, as long as you can convince everyone else, it's fine, I guess. That's what con artists are.
So this is a little bit more
Convincing everyone that there's something else than they are.
complicated a title than the one that was
Look, I have a piece of paper. Well, yeah, I had a piece of paper a long time ago, and yet I still don't
But I
even
wanted to talk to you
believe I am
about
that,
a
even
variety
if
of
I'm
issues that I think are
doing the
relevant
job
to
for 10 years.
conceptualization
And you're like,
of
I have a piece of paper, and you
health,
demonstrate that you are unethical, and you think that the piece of paper is compensating for your lack of ethical behavior.
critique, I suppose, of
Congratulations.
those ideas and propose some alternatives.
Keep
the title,
believing.
as you no doubt can read, is Illness, Deception, Complexity, and Positive Feedback Loops. Makes a rather strange collection of ideas, but the idea of mental illness and even of illness is actually a relatively strange collection of ideas, so that doesn't really bother me too much. So let's talk first of all about problems that you might encounter when you're attempting to determine what a mental illness is. And the first problem is really a technical one, and it's a problem that actually affects you regardless of what you're doing. It's the problem of categorization.
Yep.
When you categorize things, you're basically trying to determine, in some sense, how they're the same and how they're different. Although the technical problem comes in that there are an almost infinite number of ways that you can define same, and equally there are
Exactly.
an infinite number
Categorization, words
that
are
you
the
can
problem.
define different. And so when you state that categorization is a matter of identifying similarities and dissimilarities, that actually doesn't take you very far because it doesn't get to the root of the problem. And part of the root of the problem always is categorization for what? People think that when you categorize things, you're basing your categories on the idea, on the idea of sorting by objective similarity, but actually when people are active in the world doing things that matter, although they think they're doing that because they've basically been convinced to believe that they think naturally like scientists, they're hardly ever doing that. There are scientific categories, and technically speaking, most of the objects of scientific categories fall into the classical category, and a classical category is like the category of triangles. And the reason the category of triangles is a classical category is because you can precisely define it. There are precise and bounded inclusion and exclusion criteria. So a triangle has to have 3 sides and 3 angles, and they have to sum up to 180 degrees. And if that doesn't happen, then it's not a triangle. And there's no ifs, buts, or maybes, and there's no gray areas. And most of the categories that scientists use when they're doing things that are truly scientific are classical categories, or at least the categories under development are being developed in a way so that they move towards the stature of classical categories. But unfortunately, when you're doing something like psychological work or psychiatric work, what you're doing is actually not science. It's more like engineering. You can think about it as social engineering, I suppose, given that you're actually trying to accomplish something that has some desirable end. And so the categories that people use when they're trying to accomplish something desirable don't necessarily have to fit classical category structure. So one classic, non-classical category was identified by Wittgenstein as a prototype or familial resemblance category. And one of the things you'll note if you look at the DSM, for example, is that almost all the categories in the DSM are in fact family resemblance categories. And so the way you have a family resemblance category, I don't know, some of you at the back, you won't be able to see this picture very well, but we've got 4 brothers here. And as you may know, 3 brothers have little triangle-shaped hair, and 3 of them have blue eyes, and they all have very round faces, and one of them has brown eyes, and they're all members of the same family. And the reason they're members of the same family is because there are a list of attributes of that family. And if any member has perhaps 3 or more attributes, it's a member of the family. Now, imagine you had a list of 10 attributes, which you might if you looked at a diagnostic category. And then imagine your decision rule is that if you are characterized by any 5 of those 10, you have the disorder. What that means is that person A could have the first 5 category descriptors, and person B could have the second 5 category descriptors. So they don't share any features in common, and yet they're members of the same category. And that's a classic family resemblance category. All the DSM categories are like that. They give you a list of symptoms, and if you have enough of them, you have the, whatever it is, illness, disorder, however you want to describe it. Now, that works in psychiatry and psychology because once you start to think about it as a branch of engineering, because the purpose of diagnosis is not generally descriptive. The purpose of diagnosis is generally action predicated, right? You diagnose someone because you want to do something about the fact that they have the diagnosis. And part of the terrible problem that's encountered by researchers in clinical psychology and in psychiatry is that they insist upon assuming that the non-classical categories that characterize psychopathology are in fact classical. And so what that means is they'll gather a variety of subjects into a research pool and assume homogeneity because the diagnostic category is the same for all the members. But there's no homogeneity because the diagnostic category is a family resemblance category, and there are all sorts of subordinate elements associated with that category. It makes doing scientific research into the basis of psychopathology fundamentally, I would say fundamentally impossible, because there's no clear causal pathway to a heterogeneous disorder. And so there's deep philosophical confusion in the clinical and psychiatric literature, and it refuses to go away. Fundamentally, the reason it refuses to go away is because, especially since the late 1800s, psychologists and psychiatrists have attempted to delude themselves into the notion that they're in fact scientists, and they're, insofar as they're clinical practitioners, they aren't, no more than physicians are. And you can't do a proper science without having the proper categories, and the truth of the matter is, and it's plain and simple, is that our categorical structure for psychopathology from a scientific perspective it's a mess, probably approximately tantamount to the mess of astrological categories. So that doesn't mean, that doesn't mean it doesn't work. Like, I'm making a distinction here between something pragmatic and something scientific. A lot of what psychiatrists and psychologists do is maintain social order. That was a big part of criticism about psychiatric diagnosis in the 1960s. And, the people in the sort of radical left-wingers in the 60s thought that it was appalling that psychiatrists were involved in maintenance of social order. I don't happen to think it's appalling. I think it's necessary, but I think people should be honest about what they're doing.
Good luck with that.
We'll get to that. So, here's another problem. Well, I alluded to this before. Why are you categorizing things? Well, one function is descriptive and the other function is action predicated. And this is interesting too, because people are motivated creatures and they're not running around trying to describe the world, they're running around trying to live. and that's not the same thing. And what that means fundamentally is that our basic categories, perceptual, cognitive, or otherwise, aren't descriptive categories, they're tool-like categories. And what we do naturally, without even ever thinking about it, is divide the world into objects that are useful for us to use. And I mean, when you guys look at this room, you know, you may think that what you see are objects, but you don't. You see things that are functionally useful to you. But there's an infinite number of objects in this room, so if you were perceiving the objects, you'd just be here all day, staring at things like somebody on LSD. So, and I actually mean that technically.
LSD, LFD.
People are on LSD and hallucinogens like that lose their ability to screen out stimuli, and they get fascinated by absolutely everything. So when you look around the room, you see chairs and tables and platforms and microphones, and the reason you see those things is because they're useful. It's not because they're objects, it's because they're useful. And you do that naturally. And our psychiatric and psychological categories are very similar. We put people in categories because we want to do things with those people. And sometimes the people want those things done too. You know, I mean, one of the advantages of psychiatric diagnosis that the radical left-wingers of the 60s overlooked is that it's often a tremendous relief to someone who, for example, is suffering from panic disorder, to come in to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist not knowing what the hell's wrong with them, and the psychiatrist will say, oh, you have panic disorder, here's the list of symptoms, and here's, you know, a website with 100,000 other people who have it, and here's a treatment program, and, you know, you're not the only person in the entire world that has this, and we kind of understand it. And the person, although categorized, breathes a great sigh of relief, because now that they know what they have, they also know what they don't have. And believe me, if you have an undiagnosed illness, not knowing what you have is generally a lot worse than knowing what you do have.
If it's the right thing.
I'm not complaining about the fact that mental health professionals use functional categories in their approach to mental illness. It's perfectly reasonable, but you have to be clear about what you're doing.
Good luck with that.
So let's look at, we'll take this apart philosophically, right? We'll do this in the Socratic manner. It's like, so if we're talking about mental illness, we should start by talking about illness. Well, what is illness? Oh, you know, on the left-hand side, there's a square there. You can't see it very well. Illness. What's illness related to? Pathogen. That might be the simplest explanation, although you're so full of bacteria that it's absolutely ridiculous. So that's a kind of, you actually have about 10 times more bacteria in your body by number than you do human cells. So the mere, yeah, I know it's a terrible thought, but you know, the mere presence of pathogens doesn't indicate illness, but some illnesses are accompanied by an exceptional overload of a certain kind of pathogen. Those are illnesses that are pretty easy to identify in some ways or to conceptualize. So that's one potential marker of an illness. You're colonized by some parasitical organism. Another marker we use for illness is suffering, right? We generally presume two things. We assume that if you're suffering, there's probably something wrong with you, or if you're really making other people suffer, there's probably something wrong with you too. And there's a subset of those two occurrences that we might regard as characterized by illness, although we tend not to think that every form of suffering is an illness. Although in the DSM, bereavement, I believe now is defined as a psychiatric disorder. And there's some utility in that. It's understandable, even though you could make a case against it. So suffering matters. So we tend to think that there's something wrong with undue pain and anxiety. Maybe undue disgust. Mostly it's associated with negative emotion, right? We don't like too much negative emotion. But now and then we also consider too much positive emotion pathological. So that's what happens, for example, in the case of mania. So the excessive domination by an emotional state, mostly suffering, but not always, is one of the criteria by which we might judge illness. Then there's another one, which you might think of as functional interference. There was a special journal of the Journal of Abnormal Psychology published quite a while ago now, about 15 years, that was devoted to conceptualizations of mental illness. And the paper that probably had the most impact in that journal was, and I unfortunately can't remember the name of the author, he claimed that a system was pathological if it was no longer performing its biologically designed function. And, you know, that's stupid, because things don't have biologically designed functions, because biology doesn't design functions, right? It's not teleological. You can attribute a function to a biological system, but you have to do that. You're inferring it. But he was still on, what function does your hand have, right? What function does your tongue have? It's not easy to figure these things out because there are multiple functions and some of them seem good and some of them bad. You can't skirt the issue by pointing to evolution and using it as your whipping boy for poor philosophy. So, well, people do that all the time, but they don't want to think something through, they blame it on evolution. It's not helpful. It's not helpful. Now, but the idea of functional interference is helpful, but you gotta understand that your moral judgment plays a role as soon as you make those functional inferences. So what you have to do is specify what you believe to be the goal of a given system, and then define what you consider unacceptable deviance from the pursuit of that goal. And we do that a variety of ways. We allow individual conceptualizations of mental illness, and the paper that probably had the most impact in that journal was, and I unfortunately can't remember the name of the author, he claimed that a system was pathological if it was no longer performing its biologically designed function.
Yeah, you already said
you know,
that.
that's stupid because things don't have
You already
biologically
said
designed
that.
functions because biology doesn't design functions, right? It's not teleological. You can attribute a function to a biological system, but you have to do that. You're inferring.
You already said
But he
that.
was still on, what function does your hand have?
Yeah, you already said
What
that.
function does your tongue have? It's not easy to figure these things out because there are multiple functions and some of them seem good and some of them bad. You can't skirt the issue by pointing to evolution and using it as your whipping boy for poor philosophy. So, well, people do that all the time, but they don't want to think something through, they blame it on evolution.
Why is it on
It's not
repeat?
helpful. It's not helpful. Now, but the idea of functional interference is helpful, but you gotta understand that your moral judgment plays a role as soon as you make those functional inferences. So what you have to do
Why
is
is it on
specify
repeat?
what you believe to be the goal of a given system, and then define what you consider unacceptable deviance from the pursuit of that goal. And we do that a variety of ways. We allow individuals to do that. So they might come in and say, I want to do X, but this is happening and I can't, and that's making you suffer, and so you think, okay, you've got a psychological problem. Or maybe a family brings in their 12-year-old daughter, 12-year-old son who's...
Shut up, Peterson. You're repeating yourself.
Live your life the way you live your life. Because ultimately, that's what we're all doing. We just don't know it. But we're living our lives the way we live our life.
What kind of heart does it take to pursue this business? Or is heart not part of the picture?
Heart meaning passion. It has to be something that it has its own rechargeable battery. I think you have to go hard. I think you have to go hard all the time, and you have to. I know for me, I was having this conversation that I was saying before. I hear a lot of people say, "Oh, I died to make a movie. I died to make a movie." And I say, "I would never die to make a movie." It's like there's tons of stories you can tell and all that stuff, but I never finish one because with all the planning and everything that goes into making a movie, it's having that passion that's going to help you finish a movie. Because for all the movies that are out there that you can think about it this way: if you saw 100 movies, there were probably
Not gonna happen.
50,000 that they started making, but never finished. And of that 50,000, there were probably 150,000 scripts that were in development and about to start production. So if you look at that number and it filters all the way down to just 100 films, it's not about getting the opportunity to make a film, it's about finishing the film. And that takes a passion where you have to go into it with the understanding that no matter how excited someone is about your project, be it the actor, the cinematographer, the editors, anybody who's working on that film that's not you, those people, for as excited as they are, they do not care as much as you do. They never will.
Indeed.
So when things start breaking down, and it's got to be spit, bubble gum, and duct tape to keep it together and keep it moving, it's going to be you. It's going to be you. And the second you get tired and you can't finish it, that's when it stops. That's when it stops. Because you're the person, you're the battery. You have to keep recharging that battery, that passion. You have to keep it going. It has to push you all the way through every adversity.
and every obstacle to get to completion. It has to push you, and it can't die ever, because that's when the project will just cease to exist. And once it stops, it's very rare that projects get picked back up and they finish. It's very rare. So I would say in terms of heart, I relate it to passion, and say that it has a really rechargeable battery that just doesn't die. It can't die. Now, if you're saying what kind of heart in terms of caring and compassion and that sort of thing, I don't know how far that gets you. I don't know. I think if you get into films that are very much about society and how to push society forward and make people think about the world they live in and that sort of thing, if that's the direction you're going in, I think that having a heart is for compassion and love and all that good stuff. I think that it's paramount in that, because it takes a great amount of willingness to understand people and open yourself up to learn about others and learn about their cultures and whatever it is that you're going to be talking about in that film. It does take a great amount of heart and compassion to do that, to be willing to completely immerse yourself in someone else's world. But those are two very different hearts, I think. Two very different hearts.
Sure, and there can be a downside to the other heart in that things can affect you too much. When there's been documentarians that have ended their lives because they saw things they didn't want to see about different countries or wherever, and the atrocities that were going on. So that can also take you down.
Because there are things you can't unsee, and once you're made aware of them, your deep feeling for those things, it can affect you in some profound ways, in ways that you don't expect. You know, I will never forget. There was a time back in maybe 09. Was it 09? I was doing marketing for a skilled nursing facility, and it required that I have a nursing background. But I said, there's nothing I can't learn. So of course I had to read the books and learn a lot of nursing terms and things of that nature. But I digress. The thing was, there was a patient of the skilled nursing facility that ended up in the hospital, and I had to go visit them and just kind of see how everything was going, make sure social workers were on and everything. And they told me that I wasn't going to be released because now he's definitely going to stay because he has a stage 4 decubitus ulcer. And I was like, stage 4 decubitus ulcer? I've heard of those. Those are bad. You know, yeah, they're bad. Here's a picture of it. And that picture, I can't unsee. I can't unsee. It's when a bed sore has basically eaten its way to the bone almost.
Wow.
And when I saw that, I was like, oh, why would you not give me a second before you did that? Like, that's permanently in my mind, and now I associate it with this patient that I've grown to care for. So now I'm more like emotionally invested in this person. It makes it hard to do my job now because the only thing you're thinking about is their decubitus ulcer, but you forget the other reasons why they were there in the first place. The only thing you want to do is make sure that gets healed, because that is the most painful thing that someone can go through. It's an incredibly painful thing. If you've ever seen a stage 4 decubitus ulcer, I apologize to you in advance that you had to see it, because it's a very nasty wound. Very nasty wound. Yeah.
Well, maybe this is too personal. We can cut this out too. I'll ask it, and if you don't. Did you move on from the job?
I did. I eventually had to move on from working in a skilled nursing facility. It was a place where you get to know everyone by name, you know, and you get to learn their dietary needs and everything. You know more about them than their families do, and you spend more time with them than their families do. And you begin to care about them deeply, and to always, after it happens the first few times when someone that you know and you speak to every day passes away, it's a huge shock. And it's something about that realization when there's no longer a shock. And that was the moment I realized I've been there too long. When I changed from talking about people that I know and that I care about, when I stop it saying that they passed away and they died, I stopped saying it and I started using the medical terminology, which was they expired. That's what I mean. I think I need to step away from this. Death had become way too clinical for me.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you take time for yourself after that, or you had to go into another job right away?
I took a little time away. As a matter of fact, I think that was the impetus to make me say, I really just want to focus on the arts. I started having conversations with people, and I don't know how it sounds now. I really don't know, because back then it was so clinical, and it still feels clinical when I say it. But I started telling people, I've seen you live your life the way you live your life. Because ultimately, that's what we're all doing. We just don't know, but we're living our lives the way we live our life. So either your mind's gonna go first or your body, but live your life the way you want to live. And as I said that more, I realized, I will start feeling that regret that I'm not supposed to feel if I don't now start going 100% after my plan A. That's when you'll start having that regret. When you see an opportunity that you let pass by.
Yep.
And doing that actually led me into the film X-Men at Cutter's Creek. It really did. It was because I left that, and I just sat down and really just got back to writing and said, I just want to pursue this, and I want to shoot a film by this date. I want to forget everything I've been doing before this, and I want to shoot this film. And so that's what I did. I just devoted all my energy to that. And funny enough, a doctor that I met actually ended up financing that film. And so it just worked out, in that way. But the impetus for that, the thing that pushed me to get away from that and into this was that realization.
I'm sorry, this was the first X-Men?
The first X-Men.
Okay, so 2012, 2013?
Yeah, we shot it in 2012, I believe. Yeah. 2012 was when we actually shot it, but before that it was me writing and going to everyone and trying to figure out who's going to finance this thing. And, it eventually worked out. It was the first time I'd done that. Before that, prior to that, everything I'd done was self-finance. And then I just realized this one's too big of a film for me to finance on my own. And so I did go around looking for, a financier or producing partner, somebody to help me get the movie made.
And so we were coming out of a recession, and so the money was tight for a lot of these investors, or?
Money was very tight, and too.
It's always tight.
There's a certain amount of vanity and ego that comes along with, I guess, sometimes financiers. So that made it a little tough. It was very funny. I learned an interesting lesson. I have a buddy of mine, and I don't mind mentioning his name. He won't mind. His name is Varoufakis, and he's a very big stunt coordinator in business, and he's producing that as well. And he was in these meetings with me as we were going around and everything. And one of the investors said, I would just prefer if we do these scenes the way I've written. He hands me pages that he's now written to rewrite my script, right? And so he hands me these pages, and he hands one to Eddie, and we're in this meeting, and Eddie doesn't even read it. He just looks at me. And I'm reading, looking at Eddie, and I don't understand why you would do this. This is not, I'm trying to give him my notes on what he's written, and the guy is puffing up his chest, and he's doing those things. And again, Eddie's just watching. And the guy won't accept any notes. He says to us, look, this is how the film needs to be written if you want my money. Because he who makes the gold, or he who has the gold, makes the rules. Guy actually said that.
Wow.
And Eddie, without missing a beat, says, that's only if you want your gold. And I look at it and are we walking? And he says, yeah, we're walking, that's it. Meeting over. And we literally walked out of the door. And that was it. I thought, oh, we finally had a guy, you know? And you don't want to work with a guy like that. Because if you can't get
It's gonna screw you up.
down, if he has no flexibility,
Your project.
he'll have none during production. And he'll think that every idea is supposed to be more straight. And that's not something you want to work with, especially if their ideas don't work for the project. And it was very funny because walking away from that, we eventually walked into the investor that we did use. Yeah, it was a very scary time because I walked away from that job and I spent a lot of time trying to get the ball rolling. But what I did was I took plan B and I tossed it. And everything that came below that, no plan C, D, no escape routes, no nothing. I want to make this movie. And I want to make it next. And that's exactly what happened. Because I didn't give myself an alternative. I didn't give myself, a way out of it, a way for it not to occur.
When you met with he who has the goal makes the rules person, how many investors in was that? How many meetings in? Was that a first meeting?
No, that was probably our second. Okay. That was probably our second or third. Yeah, probably our second or third.
But you and your friend, the stunt coordinator, both just had like a gut reaction on if it's bad now, this is the honeymoon phase. It's not going to be true.
It's not going to get better.
Well, here's the backstory to that, which is that Eddie has been in the industry forever. He started out as Eddie Murphy's bodyguard. That's how he started out, and eventually he got into the industry as a stunt guy, and he eventually got into the place where he now coordinates all the stunts. And he has just a long history in the film, and he has a lot of experience. So he gave me many life lessons along the way. But in this one, he'd done it so much where he didn't even need to read the paper. It didn't matter, because this is the guy who wrote it, and he knows if it's good enough. That was his only point. I would know if it's good enough, and if it's not appropriate for the film, we're not going to do it. So that's how that decision got made.
Stand your ground. Don't let someone with money screw your life. They don't understand what you're trying to do. They barely understand what they're trying to do. They just think they can throw money at everything and it's gonna fix it.
In order to comprehend
to make friends,
pathways of contagion,
to have promotions, they are delusional. They think money buys happiness, they think money buys relationships. They are delusional. They are using money as a tool for control. And that's not a way to build a relationship.
And some inherited anomalies. Individuals with malformations of their personality frequently play similar roles. Although the social scale of influence remains small, family and neighbourhood, and does not cross certain boundaries of decency, spellbinders are characterised by pathological ecosystem.
Okay, it's good. I think fixed a few things.
Choice between two possibilities. First is forcing other people to think and experience things in a manner similar to his own. The second is a feeling of being lonely and different, pathological misfit in social life. Sometimes the choices are snake charming or suicide. Triumphant repression of self-critical or unpleasant concepts from the field of consciousness gradually gives rise to the phenomena of conversion thinking, or paralogistics, paramoralisms, and the use of reversion blockades. They stream so profusely from the minds and mouth of their spellbinder that they flood the average person's mind. Everything becomes subordinated to the spellbinder's overcompensatory conviction that they are exceptional, sometimes even messianic. An ideology emerges from this conviction, true in part, whose value is supposedly superior. However, if we analyze the exact functions of such an ideology in the spellbinder's personality, we perceive that it is nothing other than a means of self-charming. useful for repressing those tormenting self-critical associations into the subconscious. The ideology's instrumental role in influencing other people also serves the spellbinder's needs. The spellbinder believes that he will always find converts to his ideology, and most often they are right. However, they feel shock or even paramoral indignation when it turns out that their influence extends to only a limited minority, while most people's attitudes to their activities remains critical, pained, and disturbed. The spellbinder is thus confronted with a choice: either withdraw back into his void or strengthen his position by improving the effectiveness of his activities. The spellbinder places on a high moral plane anyone who has succumbed to his influence and incorporated the experiential method he imposes. He showers such people with attention and property, if possible. Critics are met with, quote, moral outrage. It can even be proclaimed that the compliant minority is in fact the moral majority, since it professes the best ideology and honours a leader whose qualities are above average. Such activity is always necessarily characterised by the inability to foresee its final result. Something obvious from the psychological point of view because its substratum contains pathological phenomena, and both spellbinding and self-charming make it impossible to perceive reality accurately enough to foresee results logically. However, spellbinders nurture great optimism and harbour visions of future triumphs similar to those they enjoyed over their own crippled souls. It is also possible for optimism to be a pathological symptom. In a healthy society, the activities of spellbinders meet with criticism effective enough to stifle them quickly. However, when they are preceded by conditions operating destructively upon common sense and social order, such as social injustice, cultural backwardness, or intellectually limited rulers, sometimes manifesting pathological traits, spellbinders' activities have led entire societies into large-scale human tragedy. Such an individual fishes an environment of society for people amenable to his influence, deepening their psychological weaknesses until they finally join together in a homogenic union. On the other hand, people who have maintained their healthy critical faculties intact, based upon their own common sense and moral criteria, attempt to counteract the spellbinder's activities and their results. In the resulting polarization of social attitudes, each side justifies itself by means of moral categories. That is why such common sense resistance is always accompanied by some feeling of helplessness and deficiency of criteria. The awareness that a spellbinder is always a pathological individual should protect us from the known result of a moralizing interpretation of pathological phenomena, ensuring us an objective criteria for more effective action. Explaining what kind of pathological substratum is hidden behind a given instance of spellbinding activities should enable a modern solution to such situations. It is a characteristic phenomenon that a high IQ generally helps a person to be more immune to spellbinding activities, only to a moderate degree. Actual differences in the formation of human attitudes to the influence of such activities should be attributed to other properties of human nature. The most decisive factor in assuming a critical attitude is good basic intelligence, which conditions our perception of psychological
Good luck with that.
We can also observe how spellbinders' activities husk out amenable individuals with an astonishing regularity.
One of nature's odder creatures is the firefly, a soft-bodied beetle that emits a warm yellow glow from its lower abdomen, typically at twilight, in order to attract mates or prey. Though relatively rare in Europe and North America, the firefly is a common sight in Japan, where it is known as the hotaru. Hotarus are at their most plentiful in June and July, and can be seen in groups around rivers and lakes. The glittering light of the hotaru is deemed to be so enchanting, the Japanese hold firefly festivals, or hotaru matsuri, to watch their dance. Something even odder has happened to the Firefly in Japan. It has become philosophical. Zen Buddhist poets and philosophers, the two terms are largely interchangeable in Japan, have over the centuries noted the affinity between the firefly and a central concept in Zen, the brevity of life. Zen does not think of our transience as tragic, rather it is by accommodating ourselves gracefully to our own evanescence that we can reach enlightenment and harmony with nature's necessities. For Zen, the firefly is the perfect symbol of transience, positively interpreted. Its season is very brief, it lights up only in high summer, and its light is intermittent and flickering. Fireflies are both fragile and astonishingly beautiful when seen in large numbers in a pine forest or a meadow at night. They are a metaphor for our own poignant lives.
Yes.
The move of locating important philosophical themes in the natural world is one that Zen makes again and again. For example, in relation to bamboo, evocative of resilience, water, a symbol of patient strength capable of wearing down stone, and cherry blossom, an emblem of modest rapture. Zen repeatedly hands its ideology onto things that could seem at first very minor, because it wants to make use of what is most ordinarily in our sight to keep us tethered to its grand, pathetic truths. The great 17th century poet Matsuo Basho pushes aside our day-to-day vanity and egoistic ambitions in the hope that we might become, via his focus on a small, short-lived creature appropriately attentive to our own finitude. Falling from blade of grass to fly off, a firefly. For Zen Buddhism, the firefly is the ideal carrier on its slender wings of reminders of the need for dignified resignation in the face of the mightiness and mystery of the natural order. Koyabashi Issa, an 18th century Buddhist priest, as well as haiku master, wrote 230 poems on fireflies. In one of the most celebrated of these, he captures a moment where time is momentarily stilled so that its passage can more viscerally be felt. The fireflies are sparkling, and even the mouth of a frog hangs wide open. It's a tiny moment of satori, or enlightenment. The frog is as wonderstruck as the poet at the piercing light of the brave doomed fireflies, much as we should fairly be amazed, frightened, grateful, and ultimately joyous to have been allocated a few brief moments in which to behold and try to make sense of our own existence in an always largely unfathomable 13.8 billion-year-old universe. How to Survive the Modern World is a guide to coping with the present. It explores why some key features of modern life, including capitalism, advertising, mass media, and the rise of individualism, can have harmful effects on our
Harmful effect on yourself. Do yourself a favor. Stop being a puppet and learn to think by yourself. Stop being a manipulator and start cooperating so you can be respected by your peers.
I think it is to, let's say, the year 1806, when Boston entrepreneur Frederick Tudor decided to sail to Martinique Islands with a precious cargo. He had harvested ice from frozen rivers of Massachusetts, and he thought he could make a killing selling this to the islanders in the tropics of Martinique. There was only one small problem in his plan. The islanders had never really ever had a cold drink. They did not know about this thing called ice cream, nor had they ever really tried anything like refrigeration. So they found this substance to be an interesting curiosity, but one of no value. And as a consequence, its precious value melted away, unsold and underappreciated. Now, I bring up the story of Frederick Tudor just to make one point, which is that often the fate of events economic, or of social events, or of human affairs, depend not so much on what people know or what people can conceive of, but rather depend on what people don't know, what they can conceive of, what lies beyond their imagination, for lack of a better term, things that they are ignorant of, if you will. Now, as Andrew mentioned, I'm a psychologist, and my wheelhouse, so to speak, is the study of human misbelief, how people come to believe things that simply aren't true or cannot be true. And as soon as you begin to work into this topic, you begin to realize that ignorance is the story. And towards that end, I want to make 3 points about ignorance today that I think we will find of interest in the intersection between psychology and economics. The first point to make about ignorance is uncontroversial, I think. And that's quite simply that we all live under the shadow of our own inevitable ignorance. They're just simply things we don't know, either as individuals or as a species. I mean, Karl Popper pointed out quite eloquently that our knowledge, though fantastic, is by definition finite, but what we don't know is by definition infinite. It just extends way far out into the distance. I think we can all agree on that. What might be a little more controversial is how closely our ignorance begins to ourselves and our daily affairs. What I'd like to argue today is that where the boundary line between what we know and what we don't know, that boundary line lies well within the geography of our everyday lives. It's a boundary line that we may cross several times during our lifetimes, or maybe even several times during the day. I mean, if you take a look, for example, at magazines, newspapers, websites, every 2 or 3 months they are publishing some sort of story of what people, usually people means Americans, what Americans don't know about their history, about their government, about financial affairs, about health, about religion. And the headline is actually how little people know. But it's the third point that might be the most controversial, so I'm going to dwell on it a little bit with data today. And that third point about ignorance is this boundary line that lies so close to us. By the cruelest irony, that turns out to be something that we are ignorant of as well. We don't know the times that we walk off the solid ground of our knowledge into the thin air of things we don't know. Often we may find ourselves acting out of ignorance for the knowledge and not know the fact because we don't know the boundary line between what we know and what we don't know. We don't know the limits of our knowledge. That's the title of the talk indicates. Ignorance often refuses, or rather can't, recognize itself. Now, I feel like I need to do, as a psychologist, I feel like I have to do a little demonstration of this fact with data. There are a number of ways we can take a look at the fact that people don't know the limits of their knowledge. Here's one simple way that was published about 2 years ago, in which we simply went to people and asked them were they familiar or knowledgeable about these common everyday financial terms. And as you can tell, they're common everyday financial terms. Except I want to focus on the last 3 terms because they're interesting to us. Because 91% of our respondents said that they were familiar or knowledgeable about at least one of these topics. There's only one problem with that. These topics don't exist. They were things we made up in my office and then went to Google and made sure they don't exist out in the world. People don't know exactly where their knowledge ends and where everything else begins, where Karl Popper's term begins. This is a little more complicated, but this is, in my lab, what we're known for. Another demonstration that people don't necessarily know what they don't know. This is a graph depicting data that came from a study in which we approached students just as they were finishing an exam in a mid-level psychology course at Cornell University, hundreds of students. And we just simply asked the students how well have they done on the exam. That's the first thing we did. Second thing we did is we asked them if we could look up their actual score when the exams were graded. And based on that actual score, what we did is we sorted people into the bottom 25% of performers, the second 25%, the third, and then finally the top 25% of performers. And basically the blue line indicates how well everybody in each group did. Now, for us, what's interesting is the relation of the blue line to the 2 other lines, which aren't about how people actually did, it's about how well people thought they did. The red line indicates people's beliefs about their mastery of the course material in general. The yellow dotted line indicates how well people thought they did on the actual exam. Now, if you take a look at this graph, there are 2 findings I want to point out. Actually, there are 4 findings in the graph. I just want to point out 2 of them. The first is if you take a look at how people rated their exam performance, on average, people think they're doing quite well. They're much closer to the top than they are at the bottom of the scale. Basically what people are doing is they're saying they're above average in their performance. That's what the average person says, they're above average. That's not a surprise. You ask people about their driving ability, their leadership ability, they will tend to tell you that they're above average, but that can't be, for example. In one survey of professors, 94% of them said they did above average work. Now, I have many splendid colleagues. The figure is not 94% doing above average work. That's the first finding. The second finding is that if you take a look at bottom performers, they're almost as positive in how well they think they're doing on this exam as our top performers. They're not as confident, but they're almost as confident, and they're certainly much more confident in how well they think they've done relative to how well they've actually done. And this is a gap that we have looked at quite a bit in my lab, this gap between for poor performers, how well they think they're doing, versus how poorly they're really doing. People seem to have, when they're, for lack of a better term, incompetent, seem to have very little recognition of how incompetent or how poorly they're doing. That gap has come to be known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, for those of you who thought that sounded familiar. And it basically refers to the fact that incompetent people do not.
C'est ça qui m'undermine, parce que vu que je fais tout par moi-même, je me demande si je suis pourri, mais en même temps, quand je me regarde, je me désole, quand je me compare, je me console. Quand je vois que tous les solo devs font du 2D pixel art platformer from 1985, I'm like, me replicating Montreal is probably not that bad.
Now, just in case you might think that might be a reflection of youth, that people don't know when they're doing poorly, when you go to this has been looked at in a number of settings. So let me just go to a more important classroom, let's say. Let's take a look
Il y a beaucoup de choses sur lesquelles je dois travailler, mais en même temps,
medical residents going through their OBGYN rotation or clerkship. And basically, if you take a look, you get the same effect here.
Travailler sur ces choses-là de façon consistante et profonde quand tu es dans la merde, entre des jobs pourris, entre un job qui te manipule, un gouvernement qui te bully, qui te force à rester chez eux quand tu veux juste partir, pendant une pandémie, etc. On s'entend que c'est pas facile.
That is, you take a look at the green lines, these are the perception lines, this is the reality line. It almost overlaps completely with the same line that you're getting in the control condition. Now, first question. Why is it that people don't know the limits of their knowledge frequently, or ignorance fails to recognize itself? Now, there are many stories that I can tell. I just want to dwell on one story today because it comes up again. In the talk, and it comes up again in a lot of different ways when we're doing this research. And that has to do with the fact that, quite frankly, we have to be upfront about this. All of us knows a lot. By the time we're 60 years old, the average English speaker knows 48,000 words, can recognize hundreds of people. In fact, one psychologist estimated that humans wrapped around their neurons know about 1.5 times 10 to the 9 bits of information. But it would be hubris to think that all those bits of information are accurate. Some of them are wrong, some of them are misleading, some of them lead to misleading conclusions, and that turns out to be a problem. Now, in 2014, and in my lab, what we decided to do the day after the 2014 congressional election was survey
I think I'm gonna go
people in terms of what they thought about social conditions.
Test the latest build and do a stream code right now.
And here are 4 items that we surveyed them on out of the collection.
I'm not convinced.
As you can see, 2 of the items are rather friendly to a liberal point of view.
And what I should
2
work.
of the items are friendly to conservative point of view. You might reflect upon the fact which items you think are true and which items are false, because 2 of those items are true. And 2 of those items as of 2014 are false. Any guesses? That's the problem. We know a lot of things that are true, but we also unfortunately tend to know a lot of things that are false. And that has implications for what we think about ourselves and for our decisions. That is, it's not a surprise in our survey that if you took a look at conservative facts, the facts that lean toward a conservative point of view, conservatives were much more likely to endorse them as true than liberals. And you got a reflection of that for liberal facts.
And I need to write my post, and I don't want to cast, to stream some writing stuff because it's boring. So I will leave it at that. And don't forget to subscribe and like and support. $1 a month, it's nothing to make someone happy, right? That's all I expect. $1 a month. Woohoo! That would be great. Imagine making someone happy for $1 a month. You can sponsor a child in Africa, or you can sponsor me and build something that would be able to support other people. Imagine.
And then look to see how that related to how well they've done our
Isn't that worth it?
And first thing I can tell you is